Good morning from India, good afternoon to people across Southeast Asia, and good evening to our friends in the US and other parts of the world. It is indeed my proud privilege to welcome all of you to the second day of the World University Summit. We have with us a very distinguished speaker who is going to be delivering the keynote address on the theme Relevance of Ancient Indian Education in Modern Times. This keynote address will be chaired by our own Professor Sudarshan, the Dean of the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy at OP Jindal Global University. The distinguished speaker we have with us is Ms. Sahana Singh, who is an engineer turned writer, editor, who writes on a variety of issues, including water management, environment, and Indian history, and of course, education. She has won several awards for journalism, including the Developing Asia Journalism Award, awarded by the Asian Development Bank Institute in 2008. A short animation video made by her on the world's water crisis won the top prize at the TU Delft Urban Water Movie Contest, awarded by the Delft University of Technology in Netherlands in 2012. Her articles have been published in Reader's Digest, Washington Post, Discovery Channel Asia, Swarajya, India Facts, and other outstanding publications. She is passionate about traveling and connecting the dots across different societies, civilizations, and disciplines. Her book, which essentially inspired us to invite her to deliver the keynote address, is The Educational Heritage of Ancient India, How an Ecosystem of Learning Was Laid to Waste, is available both in print and Kindle versions. Without further ado, I have great pleasure in inviting Ms. Sahana Singh to deliver the keynote address.
Namaste, Namaste from Houston, Texas. I am very honored to be a part of this August gathering. I was listening to some of the talks. You have all been deliberating on the universities of the future, but I am planning to take you in the opposite direction. So I'm here to take you back to a time when India was the educational capital of the world. It was a time when, in the midst of nature, in open air classrooms, the gurus and the students, they discussed the fundamental sciences, the philosophies and arts, which later became the bedrock of what we call modern knowledge today. So why do I want to talk to you about the past? I think the main reason, the simple answer is inspiration. There is immense inspiration that one can take from India's educational heritage. And today we need inspiration more than ever. So let's learn a little bit about the universities of India that existed a very long time ago. So in the beginning, there were open air forest universities, which gradually made way for the brick and mortar structures and then the temple universities. So long before the Common Era, we had Takshashila University, where intellectual giants such as Charaka, Kautilya, and Panini taught. There were students there and they also taught over there. Now, conventionally, Takshashila is dated to about 6th century before the Common Era, but it appears to be much older. And we still need to do a lot of work to know the chronology. So the whole of India was covered with universities like Nalanda, Vikramshila, Udantapura, Nadia, Mithila, Varanasi, Ujjaini, Kanchipuram, Ennairam. I was able to find some 89 centers of higher learning, which I have put in a map that is going to be featured in my next book, my upcoming book, which will be published next month. So archaeologists are still coming across ancient universities, which they are excavating. So for example, in 2009, the Telhara University was found very close to Nalanda University, and the work is still going on. Then in the state of Kerala, they found a university called Kantalur Shala, which was another amazing university. It was called the Nalanda of the South, and it had even more subjects than Nalanda. It had martial arts, painting and arts, alongside the sciences and regular arts. So that's how it was. And Indian universities attracted thousands of foreign students. I mean, if you're thinking that globalization is a new phenomenon, you have to think again. Because students came to India from Tibet, China, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, basically the Southeast Asian part of the world, and Greece. They even came from Greece, West Asia. So you can gauge the dedication of the students by the difficult journeys they made in order to reach India. So they crossed mountains, deserts, rivers, seas. They took every possible route to come to India. And in those days, as you know, it wasn't easy to travel. So many of them lost their lives during travel because of, shipwrecks or, being attacked by bandits and things like that. But so many of them did not give up their dreams to come and study in Nalanda or Vikramshila or whichever university they had in mind. So that's how it was. So we know all this because of the accounts of the foreign students. For example, Xuanzang, when he came to study in Nalanda, he had to cross the harsh Gobi Desert. Then he had to walk across the Pamir Mountains. And finally, with a sigh of relief, he managed to reach Bihar and go to Nalanda University. Then there is another Chinese student called Fa Hian, who wrote in his autobiography that when he remembered his journey, he would break out into a perspiration and just think of all the dangers that he had been through and count and thank the gods that he had been able to accomplish his mission and bring back some knowledge from India. So why I'm telling you all this is that I want today's students who are complaining about Zoom classes to know that they have actually got it very easy. Now, even after making all these difficult journeys, these students had no guarantee that they would get admission into the top universities of India because the standards were very high. They were very challenging admission tests, and these were held in order to know if the students had the rigor to keep up with the studies, with the education that would follow. So just think, we are talking about the 7th century. In Nalanda, only 20% of the students who applied were getting admission because the admission test was so hard. And that's how around Nalanda, in the villages around Nalanda, many coaching centers had come up to help the students crack the entrance examinations. At its peak, Nalanda had 8,500 students and about 1,500 professors. So you can look at the student-teacher ratio and wonder how they got it so good, because even today, it's so hard to find that kind of a ratio. So most of the students who traveled to India to study, they carried back with them a large number of manuscripts and books. They carried them back to their home countries. So among the Chinese students, in fact, there was a kind of competition about how many manuscripts they carried back. So Xuanzang was very happy that he was able to carry back 657 texts. I Ching took about 400 texts. So all of them mention how many texts they were able to carry back from India. And mind you, these were not just books on Buddhism. Commonly, it is believed, people think that Chinese students went to study Buddhism in India. But actually, they were carrying back texts with mathematics, science, and medical knowledge as well. And it was not just a case of Chinese students coming to study in India. Hundreds of Indian scholars went to study in China. That is not told in the textbooks that we have. So these students, these scholars from India who went to China, they would also carry a lot of manuscripts, and they would translate them to Chinese with the help of the Chinese scholars there, and they would teach it also. They would teach it to the students. So these Indian scholars who traveled to China were often received with great fanfare by the Chinese kings. There would be whole processions, welcome processions for them. And several Indian mathematicians and astronomers held very high positions in the Chinese scientific establishments. For example, there is a mention of Gautama Siddha. He was called Kutan Siddha in Chinese, and he was the head of the Chinese official department of astronomy. And he is the one who introduced Indian numerals to China and the calendar system to China. Now, you might be aware that India exported a large number of goods to the world. So we hear about jewelry, textiles, and spices that were exported and the various trade routes that were used. But what is not discussed enough is that this was also the route for transmission of manuscripts, for books, and for knowledge to be transmitted. So there is a lot of evidence to show that trade routes were the routes, thousands of books were taken out from India. And apart from that, there were major translation movements. So in Baghdad and later in Spain, all these books that were taken from India, they were translated to Persian, Arabic, and Latin. So when the works of Indian scholars like Sushruta Samhita, Charaka Samhita, Brahma Sputa Siddhanta, these are all books on medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. When they were translated to Persian and Arabic and later to Latin, they simply created a sensation. A sensation is the right word for it, because there was so much excitement on knowing what is in these books. So that's how the fifth Abbasid Khalifa, the ruler of the Islamic world at the time, he invited an Indian physician called Manka-e-Hindi to be his court physician. And then he was given the job of translating Sushruta Samhita and various other books. And not just scientific books, even the Panchatantra, the book of fables with talking animals, that became hugely popular in Western Asia. So in the earliest translated version of Panchatantra, you will find reference to one person called Bourgeois or Bourgeois, who went from Persia to India in search of knowledge. So it was very common in those days to talk about going to India in search of knowledge. So that's how Indian scientists were frequently invited to Baghdad, and with their help, the observatories and other such, the telescopes and those things were all set up in Baghdad. The discipline of mathematics was itself called Hindisa. It was called Hindisa by the Arabs because it pertained to the knowledge of the Hindus or the Indians. The Arabs acknowledged the contribution of the Hindus. They did it quite openly. So that's why you have Al-Khwarizmi, when he wrote his book on the decimal system in the 9th century, he titled it as Kitab al-Hisab al-Hindi, which means the book of addition and subtraction according to the Hindu calculations. So it is a little strange that he is called the father of algebra because he himself gave credit to the Indians for what he wrote in that book. So the knowledge that the Arabs got from India eventually reached Europe. And once the translation to Latin had been completed by the scholars in Toledo in Spain, then there was a knowledge revolution in Europe. So for example, Fibonacci, you might not know that the famous Italian mathematician Fibonacci, he was deeply influenced by what he called the modus indorum. The modus indorum meant the method of the Hindus or the method of the Indians, and he played an important role in persuading the Europeans to not be afraid of using zero in their calculations, which came from modus indorum, and he told them to use this the Indians' method so that their accounting calculations could be faster. He has written about that in his book. Of course, zero was not the only concept that was transmitted from India. After the European colonizers figured out how to reach India in the 15th century, it was as if the floodgates of knowledge had been opened. So hundreds of monographs and books were written by the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and the British on India's astronomy, surgery, medicinal plants, grammar, and what have you. The French philosopher Voltaire, he said that he was convinced that everything they knew had come from the banks of the Ganga, whether it was astronomy or the mind sciences. You'll actually find many people echoing the views of Voltaire at that time. So actually, by the time the Europeans came to colonize India, most of our ancient libraries, our ancient universities in northern India had been destroyed by the invaders. So our temple universities, for example, in Sharda Peeth, that had also been destroyed. In Kashmir, Sharda Peeth, that had been destroyed. But thanks to the heroic efforts of some of the Rajas, the committed Rajas and the families of scholars, not all the manuscripts were lost. They were kept carefully. And that is what the colonizers, when they came to India, they found many of those. So there is the example of this missionary called Bartholomew Ziegenbalg, who was single-handedly able to collect 100 Tamil manuscripts in just 2 years of his stay in southern India. So now I want to tell you a little bit about the various aspects of ancient India's education system, which might give you some food for thought. So firstly, Not everybody studied the high sciences and philosophies in ancient India. Only a very small percentage of students, they studied the Veda and the Vedic literature. And most of the children grew up learning the family trade. So whether it was carpentry or weaving or textiles or sculpting, there were about 64 arts, 64 skills that have been listed in ancient books. So most of these, the children grew up learning the family trade. So for example, if a child was born in a barber's family, then he would become an expert in hair cutting and styling at a very young age. And so they would all become entrepreneurs at a very young age. And so even a child would be contributing to the family income at a young age. And if you compare that with a college graduate today who does not have any vocational skill, even at the age of 22, so the difference can be quite startling. You must note that India was one of the richest countries in the world until the 18th century. You will find this in the writings of Angus Madison and others. So this was the riches were because India was exporting most of the products that were being used in the world. For example, like jewelry, cotton, spices, steel, and various other products. It was the manufacturing hub of the world, India. And this was possible because a large part of the population got extensive training in the trades right from childhood. So as I mentioned, the whole family would be engaged in the business and they would all contribute. To take another example, in a doctor's family, some members would be involved in picking the right herbs from the forest. Another set would be, some other members would be drying the leaves, somebody else would be grinding it, making into a powder and so on. So even women and children were all part of this. Okay, and the skills used to be passed down from generation to generation. And the ethos of the times was such that the Brahmanas, the Brahmin scholars who studied and taught the Vedas, they were not supposed to make money from it. So they were actually prohibited from making money. And a Vedic scholar was required to lead a very simple, frugal life, avoid any kind of luxury. And so it fell upon the shoulders of the non-Brahmins, the rich businessmen, the farmers, the workers who supported the students and teachers. So the ecosystem of learning ensured that the seekers of knowledge, they did not have to worry about their livelihood. They did not have to worry about where the next meal was going to come from. The society supported every need of theirs, including even expenses of marriage for their children and so on. So it was very common for students or the gurus themselves to knock at the door of households to ask for food, and the lady of the house would be very happy to serve the gurus or the students. She would think it is a privilege to feed them. So today we all lament that teachers are not getting paid enough, they don't have respect in the society. But in ancient time, it was in India, it was just the opposite. The gurus had the highest status because they were so dedicated to teaching, and they did not treat it like a business. And because of this priority given to teachers and students by the society, they could focus on learning and on teaching, on research, and so on. So that's how India produced so much knowledge. And it was this system that allowed gurus like Aryabhata and Bhaskaracharya to produce their fine work. Fourthly, the students, they spent a lot of time in the midst of nature. So they interacted with cows, monkeys, squirrels, and other animals. They listened to bird song because they woke up very early in the morning. That was a requirement. The students had to wake up at sunrise, and they had to cease their activities at sunset. So they were very much in synchronicity with the natural rhythms. So they listened to bird song, and they could identify the flora in the region. They knew all the plants that grew. And when they studied in the ashrams, they would watch they would enjoy the sunrise and sunset, and they knew that they were a part of the circle of life. They knew that for the humans to survive, it was important for the other species to also to survive. And so, they didn't have a separate subject like environmental sciences or environmental engineering, because nature was a part of every subject that they studied, whether it was chemistry or architecture or any subject, they knew that they should not violate the laws of nature. That's something I'd like to highlight. And the another aspect of ancient Indian education was that logic, debating, and communication skills were extremely important. So you have so many texts on Tarka Vidya, Vada Vidya. These were taught in universities. So a student who came out of a university needed to have these skills of debating and speaking well. There are numerous references to them in the ancient texts. And the terminology of debate was very well developed. So they had terms like sadhya, pramana, and they were very technical terms of debate. And the kings were very fond of organizing debate tournaments and inviting the students to compete. And this used to be watched by the commoners, and they would also pick up a lot of things from there. And there were strict rules to be followed for debate, like how one could debate with an opponent only after having completely read the works of the opponent and understanding his or her point of view. Only then you could go into a debate. And many times the judges would themselves be female, just in case you're wondering whether women were being educated. The famous debate between Adi Shankara and Mandana Mishra, it was moderated by a lady judge. I think it'll be very interesting for today's students to get acquainted with the science of logic and debate of ancient India, because I'm myself studying Nyaya Shastra, learning about logic, and I can tell you it's fascinating. It is helping me to get new insights about everything that we know today. So my next point is that today we talk a lot about the need for interdisciplinary learning, how different disciplines should collaborate with each other. But that was something very normal in ancient India because we had no artificial barriers between different subjects. So, for example, we have the mathematician Bhaskaracharya, who wrote in poetry. Imagine writing algebraical formulas or giving problems, setting problems while using beautiful similes and metaphors. So that's how the books on algebra and mathematics and arithmetic are. They are in poetry, Bhaskara's works. So then you take the example of the Sanskrit language. It was like a coding language with mathematical rules. So it was from Sanskrit that the idea of language as a science came about for the other languages. So for in Europe also, they were fascinated when they rediscovered Sanskrit, when William Jones rediscovered Sanskrit. So to study language as a science, that was a revelation. And that's how the science of linguistics came about. My last point is about character building. That was an essential part of education. So today we are in a society where corruption has seeped in very deep. So people try to evade taxes, they tamper with meters so that they have to pay lesser for electricity, or they give bribes or they accept bribes. And we also see a high incidence of psychological problems like depression and mental breakdowns. So this is where the ancient Indian education scored very high, because students learned a dharma-based approach. Moral values were woven into the academics itself in a very integrated manner. So it was a part of the education. So, and apart from that, they learned pranayama, how to breathe correctly. They learned yoga, asanas. They learned various sadhanas, the spiritual practices. They learned the concept of purushartha. So these are the things which really help them to have very strong values. And they got their values and courage also from the stories of Ramayana and Mahabharata. They learned karma yoga, whereby their daily activities could be offered as worship to a higher power. So these are some of the things that I wanted to highlight about ancient India, which I think are still relevant. I think it's time for me to wrap up. I've only made some general points about the relevance of ancient Indian education, but if you go into the details of Sanskrit, Tamil, Kannada, and the various Indian texts and traditions, you will find many more things which can be applied to your discipline, whichever discipline you are pursuing, whether it is management, water conservation, architecture, medicine, anything. You will find many things, many takeaways from ancient Indian texts. So I'd like to tell you that if you approach the past with curiosity, I can promise you that the collective wisdom of India's civilization will offer you many treasures. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sahana Singh. What an extraordinary tour de force. You took us back to so many aspects of ancient Indian culture, heritage, and how it has impacted the global civilizational heritage. In some ways, the foundations of global knowledge and the ideas of education, foundational ideas of education, idea of university, even influencing in thinkers and philosophers around the world. Those foundations were indeed laid down in India. Well, we have already got a number of questions, so we will get back to it shortly. But now I'm going to invite Professor Sudarshan, Dean of the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, to share his reflections as far as your own address is concerned. Please.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Raj Kumar. This is a special privilege for me to share the podium or the dais or the platform virtually with Dr. Sahana Singh. And she is one of the extraordinary people who has been able to communicate to a modern audience what is the worth and value of ancient Indian education and learning. There's a particular idiom in which this has to be done. I mean, we in this modern age, we could find, I suppose, scholars around the country. I'm thinking of, say, Professor Nagaswamy, who are, a minefield of knowledge. I mean, but they don't have the idiom and the way of communicating what we need to know. Their knowledge needs to be communicated in a form that we can grasp, young people in this day and age can grasp. And that way, I must first acknowledge that Ms. Sahana Singh has embarked on a major project, which is invaluable. And we are indebted to her for this. I mean, there are not too many people with this project in mind, and this is a vitally important project. I have to say that, I have been educated in 5 universities. I did my what is called pre-university in Kolar Goldfields and with Mysore University. I studied economics in Central College and Bangalore University. Then I came to the Delhi School of Economics. And then I went to Oxford University on a Rhodes Scholarship. And then I went to Cambridge on a research fellowship. And in all of this time, I had very little knowledge of the language that I learned in school, which is Kannada, and very little knowledge, even less knowledge about Tamil, which is my mother tongue. And it wasn't until I got to Oxford that I got a sense of what is valuable about Indian scholarship and knowledge of the past. I mean, it was in Oxford. Bimal Matilal was the professor holding the chair of ancient Eastern religions and ethics, which is a chair that Dr. Radhakrishnan had at Oxford. And therefore, I was able to see that Oxford University was giving importance. There's the Indian Institute Library in Oxford, which is very rich in resources. But in all of the education that I had throughout in India, I had no clue at all, not even by reading newspapers or magazines or journals. In no form or manifestation did I get an inkling of what were the riches of Indian learning and education in the past. So that's somewhat ironic that you end up in the land of the colonizer to learn about oneself. And in In Cambridge, there was Julius Lipner, who was a scholar who specialized in Ramanuja. So, you know, I come from a family where I know the name Ramanuja, but I had no idea what is it that he taught, and so on. And then I also discovered that it's not religiosity. I mean, you know, Lipner is not studying Ramanuja because he is a practicing Vaishnavite and wants to attain the feet of the Acharya and get moksha. That's not his motive. I mean, he's interested because Ramanuja, as Sahana explained, was a great debater. He looked at other philosophical standpoints and positions and argued about them, right? So one of the titles that people could get in ancient times is Pratibadhi Bhayankaram, which is that you are able to overcome your rival in debate, right? So these principles of logic, debate, what is pramana, what is the final proof for something that would be conclusive, what do you learn from your senses, all of this suddenly connects extraordinarily well to quantum physics. And it's not an accident that all the great physicists after Newton, I mean, beginning with Einstein, Niels Bohr, all of them, Heisenberg, have been interested in ideas from Indian philosophy. The idea of who is the observer, who is the observed, what is certain, what is not certain, is this real, is your dream state real, what is reality, who are you? I mean, these very fundamental questions that have come up in modern physics have been part of our heritage and knowledge. But unfortunately, our educational system, having been affected in a way, I mean, it's now that we are taking a more critical look at the legacy of the British Raj. You know, you have books like Era of Darkness by Shashi Tharoor and others, where, you know, earlier we kind of, you know, taught in universities and so on. I mean, our Constitution owes a great deal to the Government of India Act of 1935, and we are very proud of it. But then we are not told that in the Constituent Assembly, Kengal Hanumantaya from Karnataka said, I hear the sound of the military band, but where is the subtle and graceful tunes of the sitar and the veena in this constitution, right? Now, he was making an important point there, that we transited from colonial rule to becoming an independent country, adopting a constitution which undoubtedly has very fine qualities, but in the process somehow completely missed out that there is a whole range and treasure house of learning that we need to have, and that our students need to understand and learn about. So this is a consequence of, if you like, you know, the minutes of Macaulay, who, when the East India Company was debating about whether to continue with the education of Indian students in schools supported by the state or the company, whether they should learn Sanskrit and Persian, which was then the official language, you know, they decided that they would, you know, focus on English and create Clarks and Babus. And so this has been a very unfortunate legacy. While ironically, at the same time, as Sahana Singh explained, you know, you had Max Muller and William Jones and others taking a great interest in the knowledge, right? So Macaulay famously declared that all of the literature and of the Orient, meaning India, would not be worth more than one shelf of European books. Now, What is worse for us is that we have decided that, that even with respect to Western or European literature, one shelf is enough, right? I mean, this is unfortunate because, you know, we have a great deal to learn from others, but then we have a great deal to learn from ourselves and our past and our heritage. And neglecting that is really very, very heart-wrenching. And so as you grow older, as I have, I feel greatly deprived because our education system has neglected this. I mean, my own mother tongue, Tamil. I mean, I had to learn about what is really Tamil by reading a biography of that language by David Schulman, who's a professor in the university, in Hebrew University in Jerusalem, right? And I discovered then that the word Tamil, you know, and this is a recent discovery, and this is something I ought to have known as a child. The word Tamil means, you know, means how to love. That's in classical poetry. It also means being a civilized person, right? And then you grow up thinking, and you get the wrong ideas because you don't have a proper foundation and an education. You think somehow there's some big division between, you know, the Dravidians and the Aryans, and you have in Tamil Nadu a political movement calling itself the, you know, the Dravida movement. Now, this is unfortunate because, you know, in the very grammar of Tamil, in the Tolkappiyam, it's clearly prescribed that there is such a thing as an Ilakkiya Tamil, and there is such a thing as, you know, a colloquial Tamil, and there is such a thing as, you know, Malayalam, Telugu, Kannada on the borderlands of Tamil, and a language or a dialect that emerges from there. And there's a Vadanul, which is how to borrow from Sanskrit words and incorporate it in the Tamil language. So this idea that somehow, you know, there's been a divide civilizationally between a Tamil culture and the rest of India is quite wrong. But how would people know that it's wrong unless there was some opportunity for some serious study of the language and what it contained? And it's also a language that speaks to the fantastic syncretism of India. It's a language that incorporates all the great classical works of Tamil were written by Jains. I'm not sure whether Thiruvalluvar was, you know, was a Hindu. I mean, he may not have been. And therefore, this entire civilizational, you know, value that we have in our country comes with basic elements. I mean, you know, we all learn English grammar, and, you know, and we pride ourselves in being better at the English language than the English themselves. And somebody might even well say that the only place where you can find proper English spoken is in India, and not even in England. But what value is that? That's pretty good in itself, but what value is that if you do not know the languages of this country? If people in this country do not get an education where they learn something about the linguistics of this heritage, right? And therefore, I'd say that, you know, we need to figure out quite consciously and deliberately how to incorporate this, not in some way of, you know, some atavistic vestige of some past which we glorify and so on, you know, but this is knowledge that is in, you know, is serious knowledge. I mean, it's not superstition. It's not, you know, religious beliefs. It's nothing of that kind. It has to do with logic. It has to do with mathematics. It has to do with, you know, debate, as Sahana emphasized. And I think we need to incorporate these things in the regular curriculum in our schools and in the universities. And we cannot neglect this. So in many ways, we have to revisit what has happened since our independence. We have to revisit, I think, in many ways our constitution. I think because Jawaharlal Nehru proclaimed that it's a constitution that's been purloined by lawyers. By that he meant that most of the draftsmen were, Bharat law, barristers at law from England. And since that was their profession, they kind of, wrote in that spirit and in that language, and then shoved into something like the directive principles, the window dressing, as Krishnamacharya called it, something like the Nyaya Panchayat. Now, here we are concerned about the shabby state of our legal system, the delays, and the injustice that follows. I mean, Amartya Sen makes this great distinction, again deriving from ancient Indian wisdom, the distinction between Nyaya and Niti. And he points out that much of Western philosophy and John Rawls is focused on Niti, an orderly way in which you conduct affairs. That's fine, but he points out that what you get from the Indian justice system, an ordinary person would say, Idu Anyaya, this is not Nyaya, right? It is not justice. Now, the fact that the court of justice delivers a decision does not automatically make it a just decision. There's a distinction between law and justice. It may follow the procedures of law, but the outcome may not be the just outcome. It may not be justice as perceived by people, right? And so you need to get a sensibility of what is it that people are looking for, and to put them through this court system that we have, where there are characters who are known as mukaddamabazis, whose motive is not to settle or resolve a dispute, but to harass the opponent by, taking that person to a court and then appealing against every decision of every court till you reach the highest Supreme Court. And our Supreme Court, in its great generous spirit, accommodates all these appeals and sits on top of them with judges working, 18, 20 hours a day. Now, instead of that, there is such a system as a Nyaya Panchayat, a sense of what does the community regard as just and right. But we've subverted it. Every time the government has attempted to create Nyaya Panchayats, the legal profession, the lawyers think that their income and their livelihood may somehow be affected by this, because this system doesn't require lawyers arguing. So even though there are attempts in our judicial system to have court-sponsored mediation and lok adalats and so on, none of them has caught the actual spirit in which disputes are to be resolved, right? And we need to somehow recover that. It's not that it's not there. I mean, it continues. I mean, in most of these countries that are former colonies, 80 to 90% of people's disputes are resolved in other fora. And the formal legal system is only used to harass people for the most part. So I think we need to pay serious attention to what is in fact valuable, and that would enable us to flourish as a country and as a civilization. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dean Sudarshan, for those reflections. Since we have another 15 minutes, let me quickly jump into questions for Sahana Singh. So there are several questions. I'm going to pick up a few. One of the question is that holistic education is even more important in the present times. How can we inculcate and induce ancient learning in modern education and ensure its effective implementation in the curriculum and course structure of our universities?
So I think, of course, one of the major things is to have textbooks which include this ancient learning. So, for example, even our epics themselves, Ramayana and Mahabharata, they used to be taught in schools in the earlier times. So, because when you read an epic, you learn many things along with it. You learn literature, you learn literary devices, you learn about the society of the time. It can lead to very good discussions about all this justice and niti and nyaya and niti, as Sudarshan ji mentioned. So I would think that you need to introduce courses on the great books of India, such as Ramayana, Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, the principal Upanishads, the Yoga Vasishta, Natya Shastra. That's another very important book, which talks about the entertainment, how to present plays, how to present music, and all those things. Selected Sanskrit plays, they need to be there. Of course, I'm not saying all these things need to be there at every level, but these are the ancient books which have relevance even today, and they need to be woven into the curriculum. And then of course we need the history of Indian sciences. So when mathematics is taught, you need to also have the history of mathematics, and that also would make the subject very interesting. Instead of straight away getting into the subject and knowing how to calculate, how to apply formulae, if the history of mathematics, the history of physics, if all that is also taught, even if it is brief, like you taught about Vaisheshika Sutras before you start with, straight away starting teaching them about Newton and all the other the European scientists. Of course, I'm not saying we need to distinguish between what is European, what is Indian, but then let us at least have the history where you talk about what were the Indian scientists saying, and then how that evolved, and then we have the modern day science, because all this would help to give a holistic perspective to the students. So these are some of the things. The Nyaya Vaisheshika definitely needs to be introduced in our schools, because I am studying Nyaya right now, and it is just simply making me get a lot of insights and think out of the box. So you're not just walking the path that has been set for you. You're now thinking in various dimensions. So I would say Nyaya, Vaisheshika, and I mentioned Yoga Vasishta and all those great books. They should be included. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Well, one of the questions that I wanted to raise in the context of several other questions which have come about is that one of the things that we are very conscious of when it comes to celebrating our past is how do we recognize the past and also engage in critical inquiry? Because some of the consequences of celebrating the past also means that there is a sacrosanct nature attached to it. And so how do we create opportunities for young people to not only study the past, but also engage in critical inquiries? Because from the standpoint of what we hear when it comes to the larger discourse, at least in India today, is that the past is so sacrosanct that it simply should not be interrogated. And so how do we strike that balance?
Well, actually, I don't completely agree with you that it is treated in a very sacrosanct manner. In fact, our education system has done a very good job of making us doubt and question everything and kind of not believe anything that is told to us. Half the time I hear we have discussions on, did Ramayana really happen? Did Mahabharata happen? So I think the sacrosanct part of it might not really be there. In fact, it is in our DNA that we have to question, we have to argue about every little thing. So I don't really agree there. But I would say that when I mentioned Nyaya to you, that's the reason I mentioned Nyaya to you. The critical thinking comes right there. So if you start with Nyaya, you are actually exposed to the kind of arguments that used to take place even in those times. Even in those times, everything was questioned. So if you read Nyaya, you'll find that the author of the book is actually putting the arguments of his opponents right there. When he puts his views, then he puts the opponent's views, then he gives his answer to those opponents. It's all in Nyaya itself. So I think reading it in that format would already make you a very critical thinking person. That's what I feel. Of course, there are those epics where you might probably you're not really welcome to question the moral character of some of the characters or the deities. But even that can be done in a respectful manner. I mean, it is not disallowed for us. There is no fatwa that our head will be cut off or anything. We can easily argue about everybody. And we've been doing that. We've been arguing whether Rama is a good husband or not.
Right? Got you. Thank you very much for that. There's a very interesting question about its contemporary context. Now, what are the factors that India is lacking at present, which are restricting and limiting our rise in the higher education sector? And to what extent history and heritage can help us in today's advancement of our education system?
I think history and heritage first gives you the pride, because once you have a pride, it automatically acts like a motivator. So that's how, for me, I can definitely say that it has been a motivator for me. It makes me read more. So if you're put down and you're said that you don't know anything, you have to learn everything from others, you are nobody, that's not very conducive. So it's history, and especially since we have such a glorious history, we are not concocting that history, it is actually there. So why not use it for inspiration, I would say. And what is the other question that you said?
How can it be used for today's context? Yeah.
Okay. So
improving the quality of education system today.
Okay. No, I'll give you the example of Manjul Bhargava, who won the Fields Medal. If you see his story, right, he actually, in his holidays, he used to read the Sanskrit works at his grandfather's place, the works of Pingala and other Bhaskaracharya, Brahmagupta, the mathematical works. And he went back, and then when he was looking at the Gauss theorem, he wanted to prove the Gauss theorem, and he found that it takes 30 pages to prove it. And he said, can I adopt the methods of the Sanskrit mathematicians, the mathematicians who wrote in Sanskrit, and use some of their elegant ways of proving this? And that something clicked, and he was able to give a very elegant, concise proof, and he completely credits it to Brahmagupta, Pingala, and all that. So I think we should take ideas right there, that maybe there is a way of looking at traditional literature and applying it to modern methods. And we are doing it with Ayurveda, for example. Even today, we are looking at the herbs that are mentioned there and trying to use it for curing various ailments. It is still continuing. And another example I remember is this, this Toppukaran. There is the punishment given to children, naughty children, where you hold the ears and you go up and down, that utak baithak. I was astonished to find that being put forward as super brain yoga. It is used for preventing hyperactivity, kids who are hyperactive. It helps to calm them down and helps them to think clearly, and it's being taught as super brain yoga. So this is how I feel that, just introducing those texts and making it brief, you don't have to make it unabridged. Maybe you can abridge it a bit. Just giving a flavor of all these texts to the children of today can already give them ideas about how to apply it in the modern times.
Thank you very much. Dean Sudarshan, there's one interesting question which you might be able to answer, which is that, a lot of history and culture and heritage have been used, particularly with regard to understanding religion and divinity and things like that. But to what extent we can use this for, let's say, developing effective public policy? Management as a discipline has, in more recent times, have used some of the historical and ancient texts to develop, to share ideas about leadership and governance. To what extent public policy as a discipline or economics as a discipline can draw upon some of the ideas that we have evolved centuries ago?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, that goes back to, if you read the classics that we are taught from Western classics, Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics, there's a great deal of wisdom there. But equally, there's a great deal of wisdom in Kautilya. But in our education system, if you asked what are the precepts of Kautilya, students won't be able to answer. If you asked a political science student who was Machiavelli, they may be able to tell you. Right now, this is the problem, that some of these ideas, particularly about governance, there is enormous literature available on what is Rajadharma, what are the duties of the king, what are the precepts of public policy, when do you consult the public? One of the things that's problematic with our public policy is that we don't consult the public about making public policy, whereas If you went to Kautilya and looked at, not just Kautilya, but even in the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, there's a lot of discussion on Rajadharma. Bhishma in the Parva of the Mahabharata is giving a long discourse on what is governance, how to govern. I mean, he's going to leave the world at his own choice, as he happens to have that gift. But before that, he gives a lesson to Yudhishthira as to what are the precepts of governance. Now, why is it that that knowledge that is there in the Mahabharata unknown to our school students or to our college students? That is the problem, right? Because it's not that you have to take everything there at face value, but nonetheless, if you didn't know what's in there, you know what's in Plato's Republic, you know what's in Aristotle's Politics, but why is it that you don't know what is written about the Rajadharma in the Mahabharata? That's the point. I mean, so I think we need to be able to draw wisdom from wherever. And we are missing out a great deal by not paying attention to these great classical texts. I mean, the liberal arts schools in the USA, they'll tell you read the great books, right? What about our great books?
Well, thank you very much, Sudarshan, for that. Ms. Sahana Singh, then that takes me to the last question that I have, in which, well, one of the problems that we are facing today is that to what extent we can inculcate and permeate this ancient knowledge within the context of contemporary curriculum, both in schools and colleges and universities. And people like you have played a pioneering role in having us, rediscover this. But do you have some suggestions and perspectives as to how and what ways by which we can create this imagination and take it back into our schools, colleges, universities? I'm asking this question also because of the fact that there is a lot of emphasis on wanting to use contemporary knowledge for the future. But in this context, I do believe that there is so much that we can use from ancient knowledge that we have evolved over centuries, and what could be the pedagogical approach that we need to adopt in our classrooms, as well as our research culture within institutions, that we can draw upon our history and heritage.
So the first thing, of course, is that we need good textbooks. Okay, we cannot have textbooks where, like I saw a textbook which is telling children about all the problems in the society and how the government should be doing this and that for solving the problem. Instead of asking the children, look, what is the kind of business that you would start in order to solve this problem? Something like that. So there has to be a massive rewriting of textbooks, so that you look at them and see whether you are going to create the next generation of entrepreneurs. Are you going to create the next generation of thinkers? So then, you need to see the end goal. What is the end goal you have, and then rewrite those textbooks. So that's what textbooks is number one. And that's the reason I just got into book writing, and I just will see how much I can write. So that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is nature. I mean, we are also seeing that we are not able to, these children are not able to think out of the box. They are sitting in the classrooms and they're being given things to do, and they're not observing where they are, what is the kind of flora and fauna around them, what is the nature, because just sitting and watching things grow in front of you, watching an insect making its house, or, birds making nests, these kind of things also open up the mind. So we have to find ways that, they're able to go into nature. That is one of the things. I have many other ideas. I hope I don't take too much time, but I want to stress on textbooks. Rewrite textbooks. Ensure that you are teaching them the right things, and you're giving them projects where they are able to go out into the nature. They're going to meet people. They're going to think on their own. Those kind of things have to be done. I mean, implementation is the key here. We have an NEP, which is already having many good things. When I look at the NEP, it's a very fine document. So it's all about how are they going to implement it. It has everything in it, which we need to bring back ancient knowledge and everything. The storytelling, sorry, just one more thing. Storytelling needs to be used a lot more. And the other thing which I have mentioned in my book is memory. there were many ways in which you could remember things which was taught in ancient India. Memory training was very important. So today what's happening is we know that everything is on the net. We know that we have hard disks. So we don't try to remember much. And I can tell you that affects our thinking, because if you have, you have memorized many things in your mind, those things come to you at the right time when you want to use it, and those things, and you're able to connect the dots very well. So I would like to see the mainstream education collaborate with Vedic schools and to learn from them those techniques by which they are able to remember and memorize so much. Because by the way, there have been neuroscience, what is that? The neuro effect of Sanskrit that was done recently, where they found that students who were studying Sanskrit, their memories were very expanded and they could remember a lot of that. Part of the brain itself was bigger. So I would really advocate for learning from Vedic schools and seeing if they have some techniques that can be applied in mainstream education.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Sahana Singh, for a fascinating tour de force and also reflections on the historical evolution of Indian education system and its contemporary relevance and how it can impact the future. I am deeply grateful to you for accepting our invitation and doing this at around midnight in Houston, Texas, at the United States. I look forward to hosting you on our campus. My very best wishes for the new book, and we hope that we can launch that book at our campus. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dean Sudarshan, for being part of this session. It's one of the best sessions we have ever had. And all of us who were part of this session, including the audience, have learned immensely from this.